Later, of course, he discovered that Christianity is the living root of their culture, but that was much later. He did not wish to jump ahead, but also he needed to emphasize at the outset, or needs at this point to emphasize the outset, that he is convinced that they had no future without adhering to Jesus Christ. And as for their history, it is nothing without him also. And he talks about history. History, there is a subject for you. Every nation has a history. It is a cherished narrative of the evolution of a nation. It defines the character of a nation, propels its aspirations and deeds. It defines its parameters and foretells its future, its fortune. The history of a nation does all that and much more, but its most important feature, its cornerstone fact, is its ability to deal with defeat and ultimately its fall, because every nation has to fall eventually. The Ashurai nation is the first ever formed in recorded history. Characteristically, Ashur is the nation that invented writing. You will find the name of Ashur mentioned for the first time in the scriptures in Genesis 2:14. And the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Ashur. The earliest archaeological efforts focused on Mesopotamia. Henry Austin Layard made a name for himself as a young man by excavating at Nimrod and Nineveh. Later, others continued the effort. Very little has been done in the century, since the Middle East has been in constant political turmoil, but in a way that is a sort of blessing in disguise. Ashurai history is too precious to be regarded through the savagery of Middle Eastern politics. There will come better days. Meanwhile, for their own edification, what they have is a quagmire of historical distortions which have played havoc with the survival of the Ashurai identity. Here he states he would have liked you to consider a very interesting work entitled, or he wants you to consider, if you can find it, The Care and Feeding of Revision Hypotheses by Lisa Aronson, which sheds light on some of the most recent concerns of historians when dealing with histories of nations that for one reason or another do not have a country and therefore internationally recognised voice, and the Ashurai have been certainly at the mercy of foreign historians long enough. She begins then with a tremendous amount of work has been done on the revision of ancient history since Immanuel Velikovsky began to publish his Ages in Chaos series in 1952. And it continues, and he says, if you do not understand the above quote, do not feel bad. This is expert talk. The upshot of her paper reveals a state of total anarchy that exists in the presentation and interpretation of the Assyrian history, the Ashurai history. Okay, and he talks some more about it. Modern research techniques have brought up a new generation of historians who play with historical data on their computers the way Einstein played with numbers on a blackboard. Anything can happen. One day they make a nation a hero, the next day they blow it up to smithereens in an atomic explosion. The fact remains that very few historians study Assyriology, and therefore only a fraction of the cuneiform documents in the museum libraries become researched. The Ashurbanipal Library in the British Museum, a collection of over 50,000 cuneiform tablets, is for the most part not translated. The last time that Victor Alexander checked, only 15% of the documents were translated. And some of the work was poorly done, as usual, since there are essentially no Ashurai Assyriologists in the field. Nobody can pronounce their language but themselves, and what little has been translated is mostly irrelevant stuff. Trade and economic letters from one insignificant official to another. It's truly discouraging to see from what dearth of information these archaeologists draw their expert conclusions. They invite the Assyrians, or these Ashurai, invite these people to speak at their conventions and are mesmerised by their esoteric lectures. Look, they recognise us as Assyrians. Right, well, we are not Assyrians, we are Ashurai. And the recognition that's not we are who we think we are, but what they think who we are. Some of these Assyriologists think we are some sort of culturally inferior descendants of those giants of Nineveh, if they consider us descendants at all. And if we do not wise up and start respecting our own scholarship, we will prove these phonies right. The Chicago University of Oriental Studies has been teaching and publishing the history of Assyria for decades. What benefit has that been for the Ashurai people? Have you ever wondered about that? Some people get themselves excited and want to claim their historical artifacts. Where are they going to keep them? One time, over 20 years ago, one of the Chicago Ashurai organizations voted at their monthly meeting to reclaim the winged bull statue from the museum there. Then they realised that they had no way of transporting the 15-ton statue, and so they forgot the whole thing by their next monthly meeting. The Helsinki University in Finland has been holding seminars for 15 years and providing a terrific forums for scholars to study and share the knowledge of Assyria. They have even renamed us, or them, Neo-Assyrians, or New Assyrians, or Modern Assyrians. Wonderful, we have been revived. The US government does not recognise them as a viable nation, or that time. The British government did not recognise them as a viable nation. The French government did not recognise them as a viable nation. These are the allies, supposed allies, of World War I and World War II. The German government did not recognise them as a viable nation. The Russian government did not recognise them as a viable nation. Does he need to go on? Do you get it? They do not care if we are Ashurai. Many of his Ashurai friends answered him when he told them about his anguish regarding their identity crisis. So what? We know who we are. Speaking to people who share his ethnicity, he asked, who are we, brothers? Are we Ashurai? Are we Arthurian? Or are we Assyrians? Are we Ashurai? Or are we Sorai or Soriai? Are we Atonai? What are we in our own language? Does their history encompass Babylon? You mean the Babylonian Empire belongs to us? Who are the Chaldeans then? Are they not a great people in the eyes of God? Only we are. Should we not first agree on a name before claiming other people's histories? Who are the Hurrians, the Amorites, the Mitannis? Are all these nations part of the Ashurai nation? Is our history 400 years or is it 4,000 years? Go to your local library, he stated, and he'll guarantee you, if you are a patriotic Ashurai, you will have tears in your eyes when you come out. The foreign scholars have made a mess of our history. When are we going to wake up? Returning to the general reader, he asks, how would you like it if American history was written like this? And we are not talking about 200 years. Ashurai history is at least 7,000 years old. How would you be able to instill pride of heritage if revisionist history is all you got? Heaven forbid that we should be left only with such an anarchy for history. And you must understand that Lisa Aronson has had the best of intentions when concerning herself with clarifying and saving the historical information so savagely torn asunder by prejudicially, economically and politically motivated historians. She deserves credit, and Victor Alexander here states he's indebted to her for this effort, and so forth. The Ashurai nation emerged in northern Mesopotamia, a Greek historical designation or name for the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. The name comes from the Ashurai name Bet Narain, or home of the two rivers. The first capital of the nation was Ashur. Ashur served as the religious capital of the nation and subsequently the empire throughout the following 30 centuries at Nimrod and Nineveh as well until the end of the empire at 612 BC. And here's a little information on Dr. Bucciolati, a Syriology professor at UCLA. And some more information. The religious perspective. The religious perspective. Gotta go toilet. Block. Break. may cut this information down. Okay. The religious perspective, chapter 6, Ashurai king offering sacrifice at the altar. Although the Ashurai people were the very first human beings who believed in the one true God, who they named Ashur, they have lost their identity and role in modern times. While the world is groping for some new faith to sustain their technological growth, no one seems to remember just what the significance of that first faith in Ashur represents. There is a widespread belief among today's Western Christians that the worship of Ashur was a pagan religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yet the beleaguered churches are so afraid of the true knowledge of the truth. Cut, take 2. The religious perspective, chapter 6, an Ashurai king offering sacrifice at the altar. Although the Ashurai people were the very first human beings who believed in the one true God, whom they named Ashur, they have lost their identity and role in modern times. While the world is groping for some new faith to sustain their technological growth, no one seems to remember just what the significance of that first faith in Ashur represents. There is a widespread belief among today's Western Christians that the worship of Ashur was a pagan religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yet the beleaguered churches are so afraid of the true knowledge of the true God and true faith that they are brainwashing the congregations against any new knowledge that may clarify and bolster the word of the scripture. So much so that even the Ashurai churches themselves are keeping their own members in the dark regarding the role of the Church of the East played in the growth of early Christianity. The name Ashur is synonymous with the word God. Ashur is the name the first people who settled in Mesopotamia called the monotheistic God whom they came to worship. The name Ashur comes to us from a cuneiform name which was based on a pictograph of the concept of a single deity that was almighty and omniscient, above all physical reality and the sole seat of the spiritual world that humankind could fathom or understand or grasp. In Chariots of the Gods, the book by Erich von Däniken, there was talk of aliens having come to the planet Earth and populated it with humanoids. As proof of their landing, he used aerial photographs that showed landing markers or designs that could only be seen from above the Earth. Zechariah Sitchin uses distortions of cuneiform text to fabricate similar stories of alien landings. Both writers place the date of these landings hundreds of thousands of years ago to fit in with modern evolution theory dates. Victor and Alexander might add. He adds there, right? Also, gene splicing is claimed by both of them. The so-called winged bulls of Ashur are again indicated as proof of genetic experiments, etc. Just juxtaposing these two writers' points of view with the Greek and Western theologians' interpretations of Scripture shows us how the history and religion of Ashur are distorted for the purposes of gaining an ancient and authentic knowledge through a denial of the origin of the civilization that produced that knowledge. Däniken and Sitchin claim that the legends of Mesopotamia are records of aliens from other galaxies, and the Western theologians claim that the religion of Ashur is mythology. So this is stating here Erich von Däniken and Sitchin are false. They're twisting everything and they're liars, right? And Western theologians are claiming that the religion of Ashur is mythology, so it's a false claim there. Uniting the components of the front. The fall of the Ashurai religious capital Ashur in 614 BC was a more significant event for the people of Ashur, and in that never again would they be known as Ashurai. The fall of Nineveh was an anticlimactic event, since the empire was already lost and the level of corruption and lack of true leadership were absent in Nineveh already. Thus, when the forces of the southern Ashurai from Babylon and the Chaldeans, in collusion with the forces of the Medes, attacked Nineveh in 612 BC, the city was not even defended. Nineveh was abandoned by the last Ashurai king, Sin-Shah Ishkun and his army. Most of the significant tribes of Ashur had already headed west to the European continent and southwest to the northern coast of Africa, where they established Carthage. As the first empire that started the very process of world government, Ashur was, after its 10,000 year reign, a tired empire. Its people had already evolved into many subcultures that roved the ever-expanding world. Spain was the last province that was developed by the Ashurai. The contact with the New World, the American hemisphere, had been lost since the early giant days of civilization building 1,000 years before Nineveh fell. The early development of civilization in the New World was stunted as that contact was severed when the burden of running the empire began to overwhelm the Ashurai people in subsequent centuries. During the last 1,000 years, Ashur was just trying to maintain order within the Fertile Crescent itself. So many other nations were emerging out of the area that ultimately the whole region became known as the crossroads of civilization. It became the avenue between east and west. Ashur fell because the world became too big to be governed by one empire, let alone by one nation. As is typical of all fallen empires, the Ashurai people stopped using the imperial name. Rome followed suit and the name Italian was introduced. The name British is beginning to go also. Today people are calling themselves English, Scottish, Welsh or Irish. Imperial names are hated by the peoples the empires subjugated. So you might say, why was he reintroducing the name Ashurai? It's a good question. First of all, the name Ashur is different from all the other names he has mentioned, since it is the name of the first true monotheistic god ever worshipped by man. The pictograph of Ashur represents in cuneiform and in modern Aramaic the name Allah. Allah, Elohim, or Allah is the same name all modern monotheistic religions use in the original languages. Allah is the original designation or name in Aramaic, Elohim in Hebrew, and Allah in Arabic, these being the languages of the first Christians, the Jews and the Muslims respectively, because apparently the Nabatean is the grandparent language, the Syriac, Hebrew and the Aramaic are the parent languages, and Arabic is the child language. Also, the name Ashurai was a national name, unlike Roman or British. These three nations are the only true empires to date. The mark of a true empire is its ability to unite its national entities under one culture, language and administration. So would that not include Egypt in that ancient time? Ancient Egypt? The Ashurai people were the first people to form settlements, grow crops and domesticate animals, furthermore invented writing and numbers and defined the whole phenomenon of what constitutes civilization. We've mentioned that in our previous videos. There was civilization and there was civilization, because being civil is like getting on with each other. You're all united, you don't fight amongst yourselves, killing each other off, fighting the north against the south or the south against the north. You're united as one nation. They simply called themselves the people of God, or Ashurai. The name Ashurai comes into heavy use after the Christian era, when the Ashurai people were engaged in the missionary work of spreading the gospel. The Church of the East began using the name Atur and substituted it in place of Ashur. Although this may have been a linguistic designation or name, title, it is very hard to pinpoint accurately today just when the substitution took place or what were the real causes. It may have been, as Victor Alexander mentioned earlier, that the name Ashur has still had a sting as the name of the empire. Subsequently, the name Ashurai itself became suspect among the early Christians in biblical lands, and the entire peoples of the area began using different names. The Ashurai began calling themselves Surai, as mentioned earlier, after the land of Syria, from where Christianity came to the Ashurai people. The Syrian Christians logically called themselves Syriani, not to be mistaken with Syrians, which is the modern name of citizens of the country of Syria. The Ottoman Ashurai called themselves Jacobite, after their first monophysite patriarch Jacob, or as they pronounce it, Ma Yaqub. In the same way, the Lebanese early Christians emphasized their Phoenician heritage and called their church Maronite, after Saint Maron. The Chaldeans of Mesopotamia call themselves by the tribal name and are affiliated today with Rome, just as are the Maronites. The Chaldeans and Ashurai belonged to one church, the Church of the East, until 1553. Then they split, and the Chaldeans joined the Roman Catholics. All the rest of the Ashurai churches, together with the Greek, Russian and other Eastern European churches that are not Catholic, are designated Orthodox. The Church of the East is essentially a non-schismatic church. It never was involved with the Reformation and the Protestant movement, since it was cut off from the rest of the Christian world and isolated in the Ottoman and Persian empires for centuries. Therefore, the name Orthodox does not truly apply to it.